I'm Delisa Crane with the Department of Family School Partnerships in the district, and I'm really excited to have with me today Jacqueline Klein-Edler, who I'm going to let introduce herself and give some background information. I'm very grateful to her for partnering with me and with the district on this presentation and on the conference.
Hi, everybody. I'm really honored to be here today. It's great to spend this time with all of you. I want to just acknowledge right out of the gate that it's late in the day and you've all already had a full long day of work, and I really appreciate taking the time to be present with us this afternoon and into the evening for your next session that you're going to attend. So I want to start by saying that the frame of reference that Delisa and I are using for today's topic about toxic stress and ACEs and families of the students that you work with is our belief that every child is filled with tremendous promise, and we have a shared obligation in the community to foster their potential. And so as we talk today, one of the things we've tried to do is to sprinkle in some ways for you to think about ways to increase the time and capacity to support family relationships. And I'll tell you, my bias is towards systems and family thinking. I'm a marriage and family therapist. And so once I learned to think systemically and in the framework of interconnectedness and interrelationships, it's really impossible for me to go back and not think that way anymore. So that's a bias that I carry through all of my work. I'm an administrator for the Children's Cabinet, and that's my closest connection to the school district professionally. One of the programs I oversee there is our family counseling program. We work with about 350 to 400 families on an annual basis. I also have a small therapy practice in the community, and I supervise some therapist interns. And the topic of trauma and toxic stress is, of course, a pervasive theme. I also have two children that attend Washoe County schools. I have a 9th grader and I have a 5th grader. And so some of the conversation about working with kids and working with students, of course, hits really close to home for me. I was reminded a few years ago that as a therapist, I have a comfort level with uncomfortable topics. And it's something that most people don't have, and I forget that sometimes. My son is a competitive gymnast, and a few years ago when Larry Nassar was on trial for sexual abuse of dozens of athletes, I suggested to our booster club that we host a body boundaries talk with the kids. And every single parent looked at me like I had lost my mind. Needless to say, that talk did not happen, but it was a good reminder for me that it's not comfortable to talk about abuse. It's not comfortable to talk about trauma. It's not comfortable to talk about loss. And I recognize that this is something that most of you really, it's not in your wheelhouse of topics. And so my hope is that today, Delisa and I can normalize some of that discomfort so that you have confidence in thinking about and talking about your students' lived experiences with their caregivers. So when you have an opportunity to be supportive in their lives, you recognize that and you're able to talk about it. A theme throughout this whole week, I'm sure, is the topic of self-care. And I want to point out that one way that we participate in self-care is by being patient with ourselves and with each other when we're learning something new. And so think about the learning process when it comes to toxic stress and ACEs as something that we'll do circularly or in a spiral. We're going to have lots of exposures, lots of different times to lots of different concepts. And every time you move around that circle, something else will resonate and click into place for you. And so that is who I am, and that is what I do. What we were hoping is that each of you would take a second. Well, I know some of you are driving, and so I want to acknowledge, wow, multitaskers, thank you for being present with us. Please don't type anything in the chat while you're driving. But for those of you who are stationary, what we would like for you to do is just take a second to introduce yourselves to us in the chat box. So you can say your name again, although we'll see it since you've renamed your selves. Tell us what school you work with, or if multiple schools, and what your role is in those settings. We would really love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I see we've got lots of our school social workers, which is great, and our counselors, several of our principals. Thank you for being here, everyone, and a few of our teachers as well. So it's great. We have a large variety of roles. So while you continue introducing yourselves, I'm just going to go over a couple of objectives for tonight. We are going to work at defining ACEs, toxic stress, resilience, and protective factors. And I'm really looking to Jacqueline to help us do that, because I was just sharing with her that I'm still defining those in my head and trying to put those examples kind of into their different boxes. We are going to look at YRBS data for our own community and kind of examine some of our assumptions and comparisons. And then towards the end of tonight, we really want to give you a chance to talk and share with each other and talk about how you might apply some of what we're talking about tonight back at your school sites. So that covers our objectives for this evening. So just to kind of ground us in the book, hopefully most of you had a chance to hear Dr. Patricia Jennings last night, or Tish Jennings. And in her book, in chapter 3, she really addresses families and talks about ways that schools can connect with families. And it was great to see the Parent-Teacher Home Visit project in her book. We've had that in our district for 10 years, and we have lots of teachers and champions that participate in parent-teacher home visits on a regular basis. She also talks about compassion and perspective, really understanding that some of our families have had negative school experiences themselves with schools and might be triggered when some of those same things are happening with their kids now in our schools. And then she talks about transitions, that transitions from grade level, transitions from school to school, that these are some of the things that we can think about when we're building authentic, positive relationships with our families, or we're helping our families to navigate the system for their kids. So we know you have lots of examples of how you already do these things, and we want to honor your practice. And so we're asking you can use this QR code with your phone, and we're going to ask you to participate in a Padlet and share with us all of the things that you already do kind of aligned to these three areas. So the QR code is right there, and I'm going to put the link to the Padlet in the chat if you would prefer to use it that way. All right, so when you get to the Padlet, this Padlet is set up in columns, and so we'd like you to participate. If you have something that you're doing to build authentic relationships with families, you click on this plus right here, and you would list what your school is doing to build authentic relationships. So I'm already seeing a lot of listening, which is great. So if you have a transition event with families every year and you walk them through new practices in middle school, right? Your incoming kids into high school or to middle school or into kinder, you might post that under supporting families with new transitions. So supporting teachers and how to work with families. So what kind of professional learning or coaching do you do with your teachers? Is there any kind of specific program or partnership or professional learning that you've provided? So I see home visits up there, parent meetings, a lot of listening. Listening is great. Video share of experiences at school, empathetic responses, future night event for families, tours of middle schools, and actually taking kids to the middle school, helping them to feel comfortable. Also think about families in that process.
An online calming room. That's cool.
Really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for putting that in there. As Dr. Jennings mentioned last night, it's sometimes hard when lots of new things are flying at us. We want to really honor what's already happening in our schools, all of the good work that you're already doing. So this just gives us some ideas to think about as we're sharing with each other. We will download a copy of this and make it available to you with tonight's session, as well as the PowerPoint and any materials that we share. So there's a website being developed where all of this is shared and you can refer back to it. So thank you. Thanks for participating in the Padlet.
Okay, so the next thing that Delisa and I wanted to do with you was to review and talk a little bit about a lot of words that maybe are kind of new to you, or maybe are words that you've heard, words that you understand because you know the English language, but maybe don't really know what they mean in practice. And so we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about each of these words that you see on the slide. And as we talk a little bit about what these mean and how we're going to use them today, I want you to imagine what it might be like for you to describe one of these to a parent during like a parent meeting or a parent teacher conference, and think about if you would have the words to describe what you're trying to explain to them, or if you think it would be awkward or uncomfortable to describe one of these words to them, and then we can visit a little bit about that. So positive stress and tolerable stress are often used interchangeably, and this is a way to describe everyday stress. These kinds of stressors tend to be easily managed, they're short in duration, and they help us create positive coping strategies. This can be discrete stressful instances like a music or a speaking performance in front of people, or presenting like this to a bunch of educators. Or it could be a difficult test, and it might even be like a brief and mild scare, like losing your mom in the grocery store. In most cases, a caring adult is available and able to offer appropriate comfort, which shortens the duration, makes meaning out of the event that happened, and it helps the child move on from a stressful incident. Toxic stress or chronic stress describes chronically stressful situations. So these are states of being under constant or near constant stress or in duress all the time. Toxic stress disrupts healthy brain development because this kind of stress response floods the brain with dangerous levels of stress hormones on a repeated basis. It's kind of like your brain takes a bath in stress hormones. Yesterday, during the community panel discussion, we heard from community experts about different ways that this kind of stress and associated trauma spark behavior that's maladaptive or interferes with healthy coping. Things like disengagement, distraction, being fidgety and hyper, difficulty following instructions and staying on task, and so on. Typically, the impact of toxic stress emerges because there isn't an adult in a child's life who's available and able to buffer the experience. The stress of poverty or discrimination, for example, can wear down caregivers' capacity to tune in to their child's needs. Systemic factors that contribute to toxic stress include things like poverty, racism, a pandemic, and so on. From birth to around age 8, our brains develop like building blocks, or the way we might build a house. We survey a spot of land with lots of potential, then we narrow down our plan to a specific place and we design our house. We block out a framework, build a foundation, then we raise up the walls, put on a roof, and then we begin to put details on the inside. A young child's brain is full of potential neural pathways. As they have exposure to different experiences, their brain begins to select which neural pathways will become the strongest. Exposure to nurturing caregivers and opportunities to create strong attachments and an overall sense of safety or experiencing tolerable stress allows the child's brain to stay on the plan, much like building a house. When they experience environmental and individual exposures to chronic or toxic stress, that plan gets derailed. They start to experience the reinforcement of neural pathways that protect them differently from the stressors they experience, which results in some of the behaviors I mentioned a minute ago. Imagine our house now has the front door on the ceiling. For a young person between the ages of 9 to 24, our miraculous brains are not done developing and growing. In this phase, the adolescent brain is very busy forming identity or decorating the inside of the house that we just built. In this phase, our brains are developing the social and emotional capacity needed throughout the rest of our lives. The foundation matters. It's easier to get it right the first time, but later matters too. And so there's always things that we can do to shore up anything that is unstable. We can do this by supporting teenagers in exploring their identity, learning and practicing coping skills that are adaptive or helpful to them, taking the front door that's on the ceiling and moving it back to the front of the house, so to speak. Adverse childhood experiences we're going to talk about in more depth in a couple of minutes. I'm probably just going to start saying ACEs from here on out. These are specific instances of toxic stress, and they do not represent every type of trauma that a person could experience. And they're common. In the absence of support, they'll cause long-lasting harm, including experiences like witnessing violence or growing up in a household with a family member that has a mental illness. When children experience multiple negative events that are considered ACEs, their bodies flood with the stress hormones, and then that later in life increases their risk of heart disease, diabetes, and depression. Dr. Jennings did a great overview of ACEs in her keynote yesterday, and so we're going to poll you in a couple of minutes to see how much more in depth you want us to go today, or if we can move kind of quickly through the description of ACEs. The thing to remember about ACEs, differently from toxic stress, is that the ACEs are a discrete set of experiences that happen to a person before they turn 18. And this specific set has been studied and correlated with later health conditions. It's not the only kinds of trauma or toxic stress that you might encounter in your students. Resilience is the ability to mentally or emotionally cope with a crisis or to return to pre-crisis status quickly. Resilience exists when we're able to use mental processes and behavior to protect ourselves from the negative effects of a stressor. Our resilience ebbs and flows. One of the things that I've noticed over the course of the last year is that kind of across the board as a community, everyone's resilience has dropped. And so what happens to us then is things that we might be able to roll with usually now during a pandemic, we flare up. Maybe we get angry faster, or we react more swiftly, or we are tearful more quickly around something that maybe we could have managed in the past. The good news is that we can learn specific skills and strategies for building and maintaining resilience. I recommend that you read or reread chapter 3 from the Trauma Sensitive Classroom because Dr. Jennings advocates for teachers to participate in helping children learn resiliency skills. She talks about a mind shift. And so we're going to touch on this throughout the rest of our presentation with you. The mind shift that she proposes is that we move from wondering what's wrong with you to wondering what happened to you and how did you learn to adapt to that. One of the key strategies for supporting resilience is building relationships with caregivers, the caregivers of the students that you work with. And so we're going to have some ideas for how you can do that in a few minutes. Protective factors are the characteristics that mitigate or eliminate the negative impact of a stressful or traumatic experience. This concept applies across a broad field of physical, mental, and emotional well-being. And researchers have elevated some key protective factors that buffer specifically toxic stress and the impact of ACEs. And so we'll have more details about protective factors later on. Positive predictors is, in the context of toxic stress and ACEs, they're characteristics that are most likely to correlate with good outcomes in the long run. So in other words, if a student has a number of positive predictors in their life, then they're less likely to suffer the negative impacts of a high ACE score or chronic childhood stress. Buffering is, I love this word in this context. So protective factors are an example of buffering children from toxic stress. I love this because as adults, we often and rightly feel powerless to prevent trauma from occurring. However, we have the ability and the capacity to buffer our children from the impacts and the effects of the trauma. And so this, when we're thinking about buffering, this becomes a chance to actively do something in support of our kids.
All right. Jacqueline, do you want to move on to the poll?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. So we have a poll for you to just kind of gauge how familiar you are with ACEs. So we'll launch that poll and give you a minute to answer those questions. This is the
Shannon,
first time I'm hearing about it. So about 12% of people are just hearing about this for the first time. I have some knowledge, but not a lot. About 41% of you maybe have heard about ACEs, but couldn't write the book on it quite yet. And about half of our participants, about 16 folks, could maybe teach this course or could or use it in their work daily.
use it in the work. No one wants to teach it. And
no
actually,
one wants to teach it.
Yeah, Shannon said she's got enough on her plate. She's not interested in teaching. That's fair.
So those are the results of the poll. So thanks for sharing this with us, and knowing that we have a lot of counselors and social workers on the call and psychologists, that some of that's not surprising. So thank you. Thanks for being here with us. So also feel free to share knowledge in the chat or jump in if you have something to share. We'd really love to hear from you.
So we had this slide in place yesterday, and then when I saw Dr. Jennings put up the slide that she had found in referring to ACEs and adverse community environments, I did a little bit of searching to kind of revise the way that we showed this slide to you folks. And I found this one that added an additional layer to thinking about adverse childhood experiences and adverse experiences in general. So the ACEs that we reference in research and in the data that we're about to show you come from the questions related to the leaves on this tree that you see here, the adverse experiences that occurred to us before we turned 18. We can think about these categorically as child abuse, family conditions, and neglect. An example of 2 ACE questions used by the Children's Cabinet for the ACE of substance use are, first, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic? And the second question, did you live with anyone who used illegal street drugs or who abused prescription medications? So I wanted to give you a sense of what the actual ACE questionnaire looks like for those of you that have never seen one. It has those specific kinds of questions, and it's categorized into the topics that you see. This particular depiction of ACEs helps us frame the topic as a public issue and as a preventable problem. Most obviously, it does so by including the adverse collective historical experiences represented as the soil underneath the tree that's growing on this page. Adverse community environments are the roots up from which our children grow into their community. However, what is so important for us to always keep in mind is the social, environmental, and economic conditions that would lead to the ACEs that are most likely attributed to parental behaviors, choices, and conditions. For example, for a young person to say yes to the ACE related to mental illness of a parent or caregiver, one of the social impacts is whether or not their caregiver had access to good quality and affordable mental health care. And those kinds of social constructs have an impact on a child's ACEs. So we can move on to the next slide unless there's any questions. Delisa and I wanted to show you a little bit of data just to give you a sense of what's actually happening in our community compared to the country. So the Children's Cabinet started collecting ACEs data in 2019. A little behind the curve. We asked one parent of a family system and every child involved in counseling services to complete the ACE. 32% of our clients, so that's not shown on this pie chart, 32% of our clients have 4 or more ACEs. And then you can see on here, 76% have at least 1 ACE. ACEs nationally, there's some trends over on the right side that you can see. This reveals that most adults have at least 1 ACE. And so now remember the research about the impact of ACEs on our future health conditions, what they correlated was 3 or more ACEs. And so if you look over at the 3 ACEs, 9% of women, 8.6% of men, 8.8 as a total percent of the population of folks reported 3. And then 4 or more, that number jumps to 15.8%. So quite a few folks in the United States have experienced 3 or more ACEs. So For those of you that don't know, every 2 years, high school students are surveyed in Washoe County and across the state of Nevada using the YRBS, which is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. This is a national survey that UNR professors and researchers tailor. So it has the standard bank of questions, and then they tailor questions to meet the needs and the requests of our community and our state. And so we can take a look at some of these reported ACEs by high school students. 19.1% report having ever been hit, beaten, kicked, or physically hurt in any way by an adult. 67.1% sworn at, insulted, or put down by an adult. 16.4% hurt adults in their home, slap, hit, kick, bunch, or beat each other up. 34.7% ever lived with someone who's depressed, mentally ill, or suicidal. So that's that mental health question. 32.2% reported living with someone who used alcohol problematically or abused street or prescription drugs. So we wanted to show you, there's drawbacks to the YRBS. I know some of you that maybe are in the classroom when students are taking the survey here, the ways that they kind of compete with each other and joke with each other. And so every survey as a research tool has drawbacks. And so we want to acknowledge those drawbacks. This is really about being able to look at something longitudinally. And so we didn't pull out longitudinal, year over year. We just wanted to highlight a couple of these. And when we think about our students having these experiences at these levels, it can be really easy to slip into thinking about blaming parents and caregivers. But it's really important, again, that we think about the context of our community and we think about our ability to come together to change community perceptions and also to buffer students together as a team. So thinking about poverty levels and our economy that's built on manufacturing and gaming and our 24-hour lifestyle, these elements of our community factor into the way that ACEs occur for kids. Any comments, Delisa?
No, if you've got questions or comments, or you want to just affirm some of the things that Jacqueline said, or you see that in your own school, go ahead and put them in the chat. I know we have principals on here. I know recently I was in a discussion with the principal or a couple of principals who talked about housing right now and like the stress that puts on families and the fact that we have families that are doubling and tripling up because of housing prices and rental prices have skyrocketed. So I think it's really important to acknowledge the roots of that tree that Jacqueline shared with us. The roots in our communities sometimes can be a little stressed. All right, so moving on, this is some of our own data, and you may have seen this. So this is our family climate survey from the fall, and this is not judgment. It's just, it is what it is. This is the voices of our families. We know this has been an incredibly difficult year on everyone, educators and families as well. But it's an opportunity for us to really kind of acknowledge our data and where we're at, and also think about the opportunities that exist in this data. So knowing that one of the protective factors for ACEs or for our kids is those connected relationships, those positive relationships. When we look at this data, roughly 43% of our kids, there's an opportunity there to have a relationship with somebody they can confide in with school. So that's an opportunity for us to look at how do we build stronger connections with some of our kids. And when we look at our families, many of our families look to the school site for information, for resources, for how to navigate some of these challenges with their kids. And in order to do that, in order to have trust and be vulnerable, right, they have to be willing to open up to us so that we can help them build capacity and navigate. And when you look at the opportunities there, we're at about 45% right now who feel like they can trust us and share their struggles, their family struggles with the school site. And a little more than half of our families don't feel that way quite yet. So we have an opportunity there to maybe think about our relationships with families and with kids.
One of the things that we want you to do is to think about, in an effort to kind of bring some of these numbers to life, think about one or two students that you have a good relationship with. And then think about one or two students that you either have poor relationship with or maybe no relationship with. They could be maybe kids on distance learning. And then we're curious to know, what's the difference between the students that you have a good relationship with and the ones that you have a poor or no relationship with? And if anyone would be willing to put into the chat what you see are the differences. What's the difference between those kids?
So Brooke, thank you for sharing. So if the parents are responsive and reach out to us as well.
What else? What are some differences that you notice between the students that you have a good relationship with and the ones that you have poor or no relationship with? The kids I have the best relationship with are willing to communicate with me. The kids I have no relationship with are not as willing to meet with me or talk with me. That makes perfect sense.
Thanks for sharing that, Holly. It is, I think, building trust, right? And getting to a point of vulnerability is hard for some folks. And Jacqueline, I don't know if you have any wisdom to share around that. How do we bring kids out of a shell, or how do we, parents aren't responsive to phone calls, right? Sometimes families see our numbers from the school district and they feel like it's just more bad news about their kids. So especially with older kids, I know a lot of our families sometimes feel conditioned to not answer the phone.
I'm seeing kids that have good coping strategies and little trauma are easier to engage than kids that have a lot going on. And this is an interesting twist, the ones that know that things are not healthy, right? So there's this added element of they're feeling protective or secretive about what's happening at home and needing to protect that dynamic. Feeling safe to share is a difference. Distance learning adds a challenge. Yeah, there's a lot of kids that are, that sense of being disconnected is just amplified when they're on distance learning. A lot of kids with one or more ACEs are very needy. Here's a comment about follow through. When I demonstrate follow through for students and families, they tend to want to follow through with me and expand to more communication in a positive relationship. This can be tough, right? If we mean well and we say, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that, and then it kind of slips down on the list of priorities of things to get done, then that follow through can seem to suffer, right? And so being thoughtful about what we can do and what we say we're going to do with our students and with our families, and then making sure we follow through on that is important. These are some great observations. You guys are being very gentle today. Okay, so as we move on, so what we're going to do is shift gears a little bit. And so we've kind of laid some groundwork. We've talked a little bit about some data. We've identified, thanks, Shannon. Shannon says it's been a long week and it's only Tuesday. Yes, it has for sure. So, so we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to talk about some resilience, protective factors, some creative ideas. Before we do that though, let's take a minute and let's practice the somatic release together. So remember that most of you, we can't see most of you. A lot of you have your videos off. If you want to turn your videos off, you can. But I just want to walk you through a very quick and simple process of connecting with our bodies and relaxing a little bit. So the first thing I want you to do is to focus in and unclench your jaw. For those of you that have been doing this, let that go, unclench your jaw. Now take your shoulders and pull them out of your ears and drop your shoulders down. Shake your hands out. And then move your eyes from side to side. Do that a few times. Okay, now we're all going to take a lion's breath, and this is silly, and it will feel silly if you've never done it before, and it also feels good. So the lion breath is when you take a deep breath in, and then when you exhale, you stick your tongue out. Okay, so take a deep breath in and exhale. And now take 3 deep belly breaths on your own count, where you put your hands on your belly. And as you breathe in, and feel your belly move, rise and fall. So you're really moving that breath all the way down your body into your belly. Do that 3 times. I was sharing with Delisa before we started today that one of my favorite things that Dr. Jennings did with us yesterday during her keynote was she had us do a moment of meditation. And my favorite part of that meditation is when she reminded us, we have nowhere else to be, we have nothing else to do, we are right here, right now. Okay, let's talk about resilience and protective factors. The way that we understand kids who've experienced trauma is evolving and changing, and the science behind it is growing. If we can find ways to ensure that classrooms and school communities are equipped to support people, students, who've experienced traumatic events like abuse or witnessing violence, then we make resilience a real possibility. This fact is why I'm so glad to be here talking with you today about this topic. You are an influencing factor in the 63,000 young people's lives that live in our community. So you, as the teacher, the principal, the counselor, the specialized staff, you become a protective factor for a child by buffering them from the impact of stress on their brains and their bodies. Remember that resilience is a characteristic within us that ebbs and flows. Likewise, protective factors can be cultivated and intentionally strengthened. I want to share with you a couple of examples of protective factors that we categorize based on the child themselves, the family unit, and then the community as protective factors. And at some point here, Delisa is going to put up, wait, not yet, I don't think, but when we get to the pamphlets that the Children's Cabinet has created to help support conversations with parents and caregivers, some of this you'll see in there, you'll remember it, because that pamphlet pulls from the same source documents that I'm talking about right now. So some examples of individual protective factors for children are things like positive friendships and peer networks, doing well in school, and having a caring adult outside of their family that serves as a mentor or a role model. Some examples of family-centered protective factors are things like safe, stable, and nurturing relationships within the family, getting basic needs met, including food, shelter, and healthcare, caregivers maintaining steady employment, caregivers engaging in parental monitoring and consistent enforcement of family rules, and the family engaging in fun and positive activities together. Some examples of community protective factors are things like having access to economic and financial help, having access to medical care and mental health services, having access to safe and stable housing. I would add affordable housing in our community. Families having access to safe, engaging after-school programs and activities. Residents in the community feeling connected to each other by being involved, and the attitude that violence is not tolerable or accepted. I would like to recommend that you read or reread Chapter 6 in the Trauma Sensitive Classroom, because Dr. Jennings does a great job of explaining and pulling together the importance of our resilience as the adults who care for children and our self-care. And I just really, from a therapist point of view, she does a really good job of helping us understand how basically important our self-care is. And she gives some great examples of why it is important for us to do those things. And she links it with resilience, our resilience, which then we can model for our students. Okay, so now I'm going to talk for a second about positive predictors I had mentioned those a few minutes ago. So Harvard University's Center on the Developing Child identified 4 factors that can buffer children who've experienced adversity from negative long-term outcomes. Their factors included supportive, strong relationships with adults, building the child's sense of can-do, strengthening the child's ability to manage their emotions and impulses, and tapping into sources of hope through faith or cultural traditions, for example. Over at BYU, public health professor Allie Crandall expanded that list to 6 areas that we captured on this slide. So healthy supportive relationships on the bottom right corner. Children coping with trauma or toxic stress often have complicated relationships with their parents or caregivers, but having healthy relationships with adults is essential for growth. So as adults, our influence helps build positive mental health by being a source of support. That begins with being present and observant of what your students are experiencing. Enjoyment of school. Finding joy in school is vital for children and teens who experience trauma. Enjoying school can be an indication of whether or not they are feeling anxious or feeling safe or have a sense of safety. School is a core environment during their childhood, so there is a healing aspect for them to be comfortable in a frequent and controlled and stable place. Having predictable routines, going out of our way to recognize their strengths and positive experiences in the day-to-day, and conveying unconditional positive regard towards your students goes a long way towards their ability to feel safe at school. Engagement in activities in the bottom left corner. So engaging in activities, feeling connected to things that bring us joy is essential to building positive future. Encouraging children to find activities they love and supporting them in sticking with those activities is a way that we can foster this positive predictor. Self-esteem. So self-esteem is it's kind of difficult sometimes for folks to define. And so I wanted to make sure that we have common understanding of what we mean when we say having self-esteem. So trauma causes low self-esteem by feeding into destructive feelings. A person believing maybe that they deserve what's happening to them or that they're not worthy of love or of feeling safe. So comfort and assurance and affirmations are important to come from others, but getting that from ourselves for ourselves is also crucial. So positive self-thought, daily affirmation, kindness towards themselves helps kids coping with trauma to avoid self-deprecating attitudes that lead to feeling undeserving of a good life. I know you guys have a really strong SEL curriculum, and a lot of that focuses on their own selves and their self-kindness, their kindness, and their thinking kind thoughts about themselves. Stable routines. So typically traumatic experiences disrupt normal routines and they can make life feel chaotic. And so stable routines promote normalcy and a sense of control that then lead to a sense of safety and security. And I know that your school classrooms, and for those of you that pull kids out to do work with them, you follow like a routine, right? There's certain ways that you welcome them, you do certain things at the same time every day. That contributes to their sense of safety. And then beliefs that offer comfort. So holding on to beliefs that offer comfort, it's important for people who are in the middle of adverse situations or who are recovering from toxic stress. Often people who had experienced trauma might not be comfortable in their home. They might not be comfortable in certain kinds of relationships. And so finding a way to think about something bigger that's outside of themselves is a way that they have comfort that's different from what's happening right in front of them, right in their homes. Children thrive when they have regular interactions with responsive and caring adults. Even though neglect is the most commonly reported form of child maltreatment and has long-term effects on children's health and development, we have an opportunity to minimize that impact by building supportive and positive relationships with every student. Okay, so I wanted to, some of this is also in the pamphlet that Delisa is going to pull up and show us. Just a second, Delisa, because I want to talk about the left side of this. So one of the ways that we help ourselves to kind of think differently about our students, remember I talked about that mind shift that Dr. Jennings encourages, is to think about how we reframe things. So thinking about connection as opposed to isolation, or like the comment in the chat about kids with one or more ACEs are very needy. So reframing that thinking towards kids with one or more ACEs are seeking meaningful connection. It's a shift in the way that we think about what's happening with our kids. Asking, can you use a softer voice instead of telling kids to be quiet? Asking, it looks like you had fun, how can we clean up, versus saying, look at the mess that you made. Instead of saying, do I need to separate you, ask, could you use a break? Instead of saying, stop crying or what's the matter, ask, how are you feeling? Instead of saying, do you need help? Say, I'm here to help if you need me. Instead of saying, this is something that's really hard to do, say, you can do hard things. You could also say, maybe I can show you another way. I always use this, and this actually really works. Instead of saying, do you have questions? I say, what questions do you have? And just that slight change in word choice sets the expectation that you have questions and that it's okay to ask questions. I know that as teachers, a lot of you probably have times when you are asked the same question over and over and over because your students aren't really listening. So those are some examples of ways that we can reframe our language when we're talking with kids. And then on the right side, I pulled out a few of the examples of strategies for building resilience. So the pamphlet that Delisa is going to show you, that we're going to offer to all of you if you'd like to have it as a resource, has a bunch of different ways or ideas or strategies that you could think about for building resilience with your students. So instead of reading all of these off to you, what I would like to ask instead is, are there any of these as you read through them that you think, I really don't know what that means, or I'm not really sure how I would do that with a student? Okay, so I will keep talking, we'll move along, but if you just didn't have a chance to read them all, or if you're a slow typer and you put a question in the chat, we'll circle back and we'll return to this to talk about this. Okay, so Delisa, do you want to show them that pamphlet really quickly so that they have a sense of what resources are available for them? So the Children's Cabinet we have two different pamphlets that we share with families. The first one is these first three PDFs, and it goes through a lot of the things that we shared and talked about with you today. My sense is that if you just handed this to a parent, they would be really overwhelmed to see this. But if you have a conversation with them about toxic stress or about ACEs in general, and then you hand them this, it's something that will reinforce the conversation that you're having with them. So this one, and then if you scroll down to Lisa, they'll see so these are like two inside flaps of a pamphlet. And so this is where the individual and family protective factors and the community protective factors are all listed out. So they would be able to read those. And then the third one, this one about resilience. So these are all of the strategies to build resilience that we included. I mean, there's probably more, but this is a pretty comprehensive list of all of these different ways that we can help and teach kids to be resilient and to build resilience, and even for our own selves to build resilience, because sometimes we all need to kind of fill that cup, so to speak.
Jacqueline, we have a comment in the chat from Fatima about having a hard time finding the silver lining for every experience. Just Fatima said, I think we first need to acknowledge that the experience is negative or feels bad, and there is no explanation or justification to allow them to say that is bad and unfair.
Thank you so much for making this comment. You're absolutely right, and I don't disagree even slightly. In fact, one of my practice strategies is a model called living ideation. And what you're describing is exactly the way that we approach this. So we don't talk someone out of a bad experience. We don't talk them out of their hard feelings. We do allow the space for something to feel bad and something to be unfair. And once we start to think about silver linings as even the smallest, slightest thing that isn't all bad, they become a little bit easier to find. So it could be something as simple as you're sitting with a student and they're describing something that is really, really awful, and you're allowing them that space to talk about the thing that is making them so sad or so mad or that is hurting them so much. A silver lining to that moment right there is that you and that student are having an opportunity to sit together quietly. And that is an experience that you wouldn't have had if they weren't having a bad day, or if that bad thing didn't happen to them. And so the silver lining doesn't have to be this like opposite side of a coin or something really major or something that is really positive and wonderful and beautiful. It can be something as simple as, I'm so grateful that I have an opportunity to sit with you today and support you because this is really hard for you. And that can become the silver lining. Thank you so much for that comment. So this first pamphlet with the those first 3 pages in that PDF, that's one entire pamphlet. It's extremely comprehensive. We intentionally built this pamphlet to teach families about ACEs, to teach them about toxic stress, to teach them that this is a community issue and that it's a solvable problem, and then to talk about resilience and resiliency as like a counterbalance to what occurs in their lives. And it's very dense reading, as you can tell. So then we created a second one, and it's much, there's more white space, there's more, it's takes the message and it really pares it down to the most essential pieces. And so this one might be more appropriate to hand to someone if you haven't had a conversation with them and gone into some detail about toxic stress and about ACEs and about resilience factors. And so this one might be easier for someone to take a look at when they've had little to no exposure or conversation about these topics. So this is like so that last one was like a trifold, is really in depth, and this one is like a open close kind of brochure. So you can see it's the same topics, but it's just kind of pared down and simplified a little bit, so that it's not a whole bunch of overwhelming information.
So we want you to think about how you might approach these conversations with families, and also have you think about your relationship with that family. And we're going to put you into some breakout rooms and give you about 10 minutes to just talk and chat with each other. So I will put the questions for you to consider into the chat, and then I'll split you into breakout rooms and just give you a chance to talk to your colleagues for 10 minutes.
Welcome back, all of you. So we have just a couple of more minutes left in our session today. And so what Delisa and I would like to do is invite one of your colleagues, Melissa, to share an example of a reframe that she learned in her breakout session with all of us, and then we'll wrap up for the day.
We were just talking about something that I've struggled with that's a new, I guess you would call it issue, but or a form of trauma that I'm experiencing in our school. And that's with our distance learners. I was able to bring most of our students back that were on distance learning, which was about 120 students after winter break when we opened up to the 75% capacity. But the students who are still doing distance learning, what I'm finding is a lot of them have the same profile of being in homes where the parents don't want to send them back to school because they're still just very hypersensitive about what's going on with COVID. They're very afraid. And so their kiddos are also very hypersensitive. And but what we're also finding is the parents aren't helping them with their work, or they don't show up, or they stay with their video off the entire time. And so then the teachers come to me saying, what do? I'm really upset with these parents. They're not helping their kids. One of the ways to reframe that would be to encourage our teachers to think about the fact that these parents are just in like that hyper, I'm going to protect my child mode, which you sure can't fault a parent for being protective in the sense that they're wanting their child to be healthy, to be safe, or, you know, maybe they have older parents in the home. Like I was talking to a mom yesterday at a volleyball tournament, and she said, my husband's 86-year-old grandma lives with us. And so, you know, you don't stop to think sometimes as the educator who's in the building that parents have multi-generational situations going on, or, you know, a parent might work in the health field, and maybe that's why they're really hypersensitive to this. So I really appreciated how you helped me reframe my thinking with.
Those were wonderful, Melissa. I don't think I could have described that better myself. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
So we just want to leave you with a couple of things. Thanks, Melissa, and give you an opportunity to also order some resources for your school site. So encourage you to read the book. There's some beautiful quotes in there about all of us just wanting to be connected as human beings and having a community. And then we want to give you this resource to be able to order some of these newly created brochures to start your conversations with families and help them discover. There's other parts of the country that have done this, and from much of the stories that I've read, families do find it empowering to understand like the trauma that they may have experienced in their life, the ACEs, and have a deeper understanding and build their capacity to move forward. So we want to say thank you tonight. I want to say thank you to Jacqueline, because I'm not sure this could have happened without her. So thank you very much to Jacqueline.
You're very welcome. Thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you.